There we go. So thank you all and welcome. Uh, I'm glad we're recording. I'm David Prager. Uh, Welcome to West End Synagogue's four-part series, educational series on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict presented by our esteemed Rabbi Maurice Harris, a Reconstructionist rabbi, and the Israel Affairs Specialist at Reconstructing Judaism. This is a four-part series, and it's being presented on four consecutive Tuesdays today, and each consecutive Tuesday in January at 7 p.m. So please mark your calendars. Of course, you're welcome to attend all four sessions or any selection of them. This event has been sponsored by West End Synagogue, but also by its Israel Connections Committee and its Adult Education Committee. So we thank all of those people for all their efforts to make this happen, and we thank Susan Shore for adjusting other events to allow us to use these four Tuesdays. But we also welcome visitors from many other congregations, and there's many faces I don't know, and a few that I do, from SAJ, the Society for Advancement of Judaism, for Congregation Bet Am Shalom, and from many others. So thank you all for coming in. We have an astounding 129 people on, and we had 240 registered, which is truly remarkable. So it is a tribute to the importance of the issues and, of course, the importance of the speaker. Let me introduce you to that speaker. And you probably can see Rabbi Maurice. Maurice, would you perhaps spotlight yourself? There you go. So let me just give you a short background on the rabbi, and then we can proceed with the discussion. He is the child of a Moroccan Israeli Jewish mother and an Ashkenazi Midwestern American Jewish father, who spent most of his childhood summers among his family in working class Moroccan neighborhoods in Tel Aviv. In 2003, Maurice received a rabbinic ordination from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, after which he served as an associate rabbi at Temple Beth Israel in Eugene, Oregon, from 2011 until 2011. For the past 7.5 years, Rabbi Maurice has worked as Associate Director for Thriving Communities, kind of a liaison function from Reconstructing Judaism, and also as its Israel Affairs Specialist at Reconstructing Judaism. He's also the author of several books, but we'll save them for later if people are interested. Let me briefly describe the course. It will provide a four-part comprehensive overview of the major components of the Israel-Palestinian conflict, admittedly a challenging subject. To do so, Rabbi Harris uses a dual narrative approach that alternates between what we might think of as a classical Jewish Zionist narrative or point of view and a classical Palestinian narrative or point of view. Presenting the perspectives side by side, the course describes and attempts to humanize and understand both in a way that honors the depth, humanity, and complexity of the people involved in the conflict. Although the course presents both narratives, Rabbi Harris approaches the subject from a progressive Zionist perspective, while urging people to seek out and explore other points of view as well. As a reminder, the views and analysis presented are entirely Rabbi Harris's and do not speak officially for West End Synagogue or Reconstructing Judaism as an organization. The lecture should take about an hour and a quarter. To keep things flowing smoothly, Rabbi Harris, this is important, Rabbi Harris will take questions at the end, and only if they are written in the chat. Spoken questions would be very difficult to do with this large number of people. So we ask you to put your questions in the chat. Probably a good idea to jot them down and save them for the end, because that's when we are most likely to see them. So I suggest that you save them for the end or near the end, write them down. We will try to put questions together or select questions that seem most prominent. I've mentioned the weather concerns. If there is a problem with internet connectivity, we'll deal with that as it comes. And thank you all. Let's begin. Rabbi Harris, the lectern is yours.
Thanks. And I even remembered to unmute. Thank you all for having me on this platform, in this Zoom platform. And I'm going to jump right in. Um, Thank you
Before you
also.
do, I'm going to mute all and ask that you unmute yourself. For some reason, Rabbi,
There we
you're still
go.
muted. There you go. Perfect.
There we go.
Terrific.
Um, Hi, uh, my name is Rabbi Maurice Harris, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to share a little bit of what I've learned over the past 30 years studying the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the mid 2000s, while I was serving as a rabbi at a Reconstructionist synagogue in Eugene, Oregon, I was invited by the head of the Judaic Studies Department at the University of Oregon to teach a course called Israelis and Palestinians. With trepidation, I agreed, and then I went on to teach the course for the next 4 years. This presentation is largely based on materials I developed for that course. And as has already been said, I want to note that while I work for Reconstructing Judaism, this presentation and its content do not officially speak for the movement. They're mine alone. And as you'll notice, I will repeatedly urge people to seek out different teachers and perspectives. And the session is being recorded. And if the recordings come out good, we may want to use them as an evergreen resource on our website. So just wanted to make sure people are aware of that. Quick overview of what we're going to cover during these 4 sessions using a dual narrative approach. Today, we're going to learn a little bit about what it means to use a dual narrative approach, and then do that covering early history, the way each of the narratives understands it, and get to the end of World War II.
Right.
Next week, session 2, we'll start with the founding of the State of Israel, the beginnings of the Palestinian refugee crisis, and then take us all the way up through 1967, through the Six-Day War. Session 3 takes us from the very end of the 1960s all the way through to the first year after the signing of the Oslo Agreement, 1994. And then session 4 takes us through the last 30 years, the struggles and the collapse of Oslo, the rise of radicals, reactionaries, and cosmic warriors. I'll explain what I mean by that, and options for the future. I want to also just add that I recognize oh so deeply that this is not any old moment when we're gathering together to study this topic. This is a moment when all of us are in a lot of turmoil, when we are continuing to experience the trauma of the events of October 7th, when many in our communities have been torn internally by different feelings and perhaps wavering points of view about specifics of the ongoing crisis. All kinds of conflict, as we know, has emerged within different parts of the Jewish community over what different people in our community think is the best thing to do, or the right thing to do, or the right thing to support in this red hot moment. And this course isn't really built to focus on that. So I want to name that. I still think this is an enormously helpful thing for all of us to take some time to learn together. But I also want to just make sure folks understand that while we are all carrying what we're carrying that's tied to this unusual moment into this learning experience together, the course itself is really meant to be a broad overview. So, having said all of that, I am guessing that one of the more intriguing aspects of the title of this presentation is the phrase progressive Zionist perspective. So here's what I mean by that term. Um, Progressive Zionism is guided by a matrix of values that include the ones that you see here on your screen. What progressive Zionism has in common with other forms of Zionism is the belief in the existence of a Jewish national homeland, providing Jews self-determination and refuge, located in at least part of our people's ancient land. That's what progressive Zionism has in common with all the other flavors of Zionism that exist. Progressive Zionism insists that the Jewish state be a democratic state that protects the human and civil rights of all of its inhabitants, as well as people who are under its military or civil authority. It believes in an Israel that guarantees freedom of religion and that treats all of the different movements of Judaism equally. Progressive Zionism is an anti-fundamentalist kind of Zionism that respects the legitimate rights and national aspirations of the Palestinians, and that is committed to seeking peace and reaching a negotiated, just resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that acknowledges the rights and needs of both peoples. It is sometimes also referred to, especially in Israel, as left-wing Zionism. Progressive Zionism believes that Jewish Israelis and Palestinian Arabs both have strongly developed national mythic narratives of the conflict, that those narratives deserve to be taken seriously, and that getting to a just and peaceful resolution will require both sides to understand the other's narrative and to recognize the limitations of both narratives to capture the fullness of the conflict. Throughout this mini course, I will be referring to a dual narrative perspective, a dual narrative approach, and I'll toggle back and forth between a Jewish-Israeli narrative and a Palestinian narrative. Now, because of who I am, a progressive rabbi with family in Israel and a whole bunch of biases I'm probably not even fully aware of, my way of presenting on this topic is bound to be incomplete and inadequate at properly representing the views of people to my right or to my left on the Israeli and Palestinian sides of the divide. So I urge you to seek other voices and question everything. This image that's there on the screen right now is just two examples of books that have been published in the last 15 years where the co-authors use a dual narrative approach very self-consciously, and there are several other books out there. So let's get started. A Jewish narrative begins with the birth of the Jewish people in the ancient land of Israel. Somewhere around 3,200 years ago, a group of tribes emerged in what was then the land of Canaan. And they identified themselves as the tribes of Israel, united by their belief in their God. Over time, they consolidated into a monarchy that grew and shrank and was overrun by rival nations and restored for the better part of 1,000 years. This is one of the first differences between Israeli and Palestinian narratives that jumps out at us. Jewish narratives of the conflict usually start with ancient Israelite civilization, and as they tell the story of the Jewish people and its relationship to its homeland, the story follows periods of mass exile and periods of return. And as we'll see in a moment, a Jewish narrative tends to be much longer historically than the most common historical starting points for a classic Palestinian narrative. Quick pause to say something about how I use three different words. I sometimes refer to a Jewish narrative, an Israeli narrative, or a Zionist narrative. That's a little sloppy of me, but I'm going to beg your indulgence. I am going to be using those three words interchangeably. And that is a little. Okay, moving forward. In contrast, Palestinian narratives usually start somewhere in the 1800s, though sometimes they'll start as far back as the original Muslim conquest of the 7th and 8th centuries. Palestinian narratives tend to focus on measuring loss and dispossession over time. As is always the case with deeply held mythic narratives, whether they are religious or national or both, the Israeli and Palestinian ways of starting the story make sense to their respective peoples. So let's dive in further to the Jewish narrative. As I mentioned earlier, Israelite civilization, which would come to be called Judean or Jewish civilization, had about a 1,200-year run before the Romans destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the majority of the Jews during the wars of the years 70 and 132 CE. Now, that 1,200-year run included periods of civil war, partial or total defeat by outside empires, periods of rebuilding, more civil wars, as well as periods of being occupied and dominated by outside powers like the Syrian Greeks and later the Romans. During that stretch of over 1,000 years, ancient Israel produced the Hebrew Bible and a good portion of the Christian scriptures. It is where rabbinic Judaism coalesced and where Christianity began. Some 500 years after the Roman destruction, Jerusalem and ancient Israel became important to the fast-growing new monotheistic religion out of Arabia, Islam. Because of the geographic location of the land, it was and continues to be a place of strategic importance. As this 16th century German map shows, Jerusalem, and really the entire strip of land along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, sits at the meeting place of three continents. And before the peoples of Africa, Europe, and Asia became aware of the Americas, it is easy to see why this territory was seen as being the center of human civilization. Throughout the many centuries that ancient Israel existed as a sovereign nation, it was always an uphill struggle to maintain its independence. Empires centered in Egypt to the south, Assyria to the north, and Babylon to the east were constantly fighting each other, and Israel was a piece of terrain that all of them found advantageous to hold. For most of ancient Israel's history, its rulers found it better to cut deals with one of the competing big empires than to stand completely independent of all of them and try to hold down the fort. The Roman destruction of the year 70 CE changed everything, beginning what would become a 19th century period of Jewish exile. Oh, there were small numbers of Jews who continued to live in the land throughout, but Jews became a people who were nowhere sovereign. The destruction of ancient Judea by the Emperor Vespasian's general, Titus, was celebrated in Rome with the erecting of the Arch of Titus, which you can visit today. It includes this famous relief depicting Roman soldiers carrying off the sacred objects from the temple. As Jews adjusted to their new situation of exile, Rome commemorated its victory by minting a new series of coins. Featuring the Emperor Vespasian's face on the one side and an image with the caption Iudea capta, Judea conquered, on the other. As the Romans tended to do, they depicted themselves in the form of a man standing tall, helmet and shield behind him in the aftermath of victory. And they depicted the Jews as a woman, head down, in despair, under the man's control. These coins were plentiful, and these kinds of images seared into Jewish consciousness. The Catholic Church found its own use for this motif of depicting the defeated and discredited Jews as a downcast woman, set next to her triumphant Christian counterpart. Across medieval Europe, cathedrals featured hundreds of sculptures like this one at Notre Dame de Paris, called Synagoga and Ecclesia. They depict a woman standing proudly with a crown, scepter, and chalice, and a serene smile on her face. She was Ecclesia, the church, with all its truth and glory. Beside her is Synagoga, representing the Jews, blind to the truth, head downcast, her crown fallen off, her staff broken. Instead of holding a chalice with the wine of communion, she holds the tablets of the law, now superseded by Christian salvation. So, why this history lesson? Because these are some of the patterns, images, and memes that shaped centuries of Jewish consciousness, especially in Europe after the Roman exile. The Romans deported Jews to different parts of their empire, and diaspora Jewish life began in earnest.
Rabbi Harris, I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second. If you can hear me, a few people have emailed me saying they're having a little trouble hearing. So if you can speak closer to your microphone or louder or increase your volume, that would be
Sure,
helpful. And I
that's
apologize
important.
for the interruption.
Let me just check. How is this compared to the previous?
Seems good from where I'm sitting, but I will let others respond. Several people say their volume is strong.
Oh, good. Okay. My special fancy plug-in mic seems to be worse than the one that's embedded in the laptop. So, what are you going to do? Okay. Here we are. As a people and a religion, Jews wove their memories of their homeland into their daily prayers, their festivals, their rituals, and their key life cycle moments. 3 times they daily faced Jerusalem when they prayed, and they concluded major holy days with the phrase, "Next year in Jerusalem." Jewish wedding ceremonies would end with the groom reciting a verse from Psalms, "If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, may the strength of my strong hand wither," followed by the smashing of a glass, a tradition that began as a reminder that even in the joyous moment of a wedding, the world and the Jewish people are fundamentally broken as we have been banished from our holy city. Religiously, Jewish self-understanding revolved around the theme of exile and return, a theme that echoes throughout Jewish prayers. Let me pause again to make sure sound's coming through okay.
I'm not hearing any complaints, so I thank you.
Great. The history of the many persecutions, humiliations, massacres, and expulsions that Jews experienced throughout the next 18 centuries is vast and beyond what we can cover in this class. It would also be wrong to characterize all those centuries as an unending series of episodes of suffering. It's more accurate to describe Jewish civilization in the many parts of the world where it took root as filled with ups and downs and a lot of mediocre stretches in between. Precariousness is probably the best way to describe the Jewish condition. Uncertain. After a stretch of a few centuries of stability, tolerance, and even prosperity, things could go upside down for Jews abruptly. Among the worst of the persecutions that Jews faced during pre-modern times were the Crusades. Although Jews were not the primary target of the crusading armies that sought to retake the Holy Land from Islamic rule, they bore the brunt of some of the most inhumane violence of the Crusaders. During their trek from the heart of Europe to the gates of Jerusalem, Crusaders passed through Jewish communities in parts of Germany, such as Speyer, Worms, Mainz, Rhine, and Cologne. Often, Crusaders plundered and massacred these Jewish communities or sought to impose forced conversions upon them. Countless Rhineland Jews chose an honorable suicide, Kiddush Hashem, sanctification in the name of God by being holy. They killed their own family members with their own hands before taking their own lives. The ones who did not choose this fate were branded as traitors and killed by the Crusaders. You can see from some of these quotes what kind of religiously motivated hatred fueled these traveling bands of zealots who were inclined towards pogroms. I chose to emphasize the Crusades in part because, from a Jewish perspective, there's more than just the injustice of being subjected to demonizing religious hatred and violence involved here. Because the Crusaders were laying God-given claim to the Jews' ancient homeland, and they were seeking to wrest it from Muslim rulers who also asserted a God-given claim to the same land. Nowhere in the mix was the possibility that a terrible historic wrong had been done to the people who had been forcibly exiled from that land, whose ancestors were buried there, and who continued to turn to face that land in their daily prayers. For Jews, this fact emphasized their powerlessness and erasure amidst the warring religious narratives of two massively larger groups, neither of which would regard the Holy Land as holy were it not for the 1,000+ years of biblical Jewish civilization that had preceded their arrival. Okay. Let's just pause for a moment because we're about to make one of many hard pivots in this class. One of the hazards of doing a dual narrative class and pivoting from one narrative to the other is whiplash, like your head spins. And I cannot take responsibility for chiropractor bills or other problems that might result. But what I want to also just say is, I don't know how it felt for all of you to kind of be listening to me start that very first part of a classic Zionist narrative, but we were really in it. We were deep in it, in a narrative that has a certain kind of mythic power and beauty and way of rolling itself out in the Jewish imagination. So now we're going to pause and make a hard pivot. Going to go back to our slideshow. We're going to pivot to a Palestinian narrative. And I want to say this caveat that I may repeat a few times during the course. Um, I am far more likely to get some things wrong because I'm not Palestinian and because I am who I am. So, what you're really about to hear is a progressive Zionist's understanding of the Palestinian narrative. That is not a substitute for hearing Palestinian narratives directly from Palestinians. At the same time, and please stay with me as I tease out this notion, embedded within each of these two narratives is the way each group tends to understand each other's narrative. I'm talking about people in both groups who are really trying to learn about the other's narrative and who are not trying to invalidate it from the outset. But people who do try to learn the other's narrative, one of the things that develops is that you get your own, let's say, limited understanding or refracted understanding of the other's narrative. And what I'm offering in this class is one example of how a progressive Zionist Jewish person hears and repeats his best understanding of a mainstream Palestinian narrative. And just as I would insist that people make sure to hear Jewish narratives from Jews, I urge you to hear Palestinian narratives from Palestinians directly too. With all those caveats stated, let's move forward. So, as I said before, sometimes the Palestinian narrative begins with the story of Islam's beginnings. One of the key stories of revelation in the Quran describes a mystical night journey that the Prophet Muhammad took from Mecca to Jerusalem. And this is a teaching that came to provide the basis for the building of the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem in the year 691 CE. After centuries of Byzantine Christian rule, the Holy Land was conquered and absorbed into the Islamic Empire, which by the 700s had expanded dramatically. For the small Jewish population that had been living in the Holy Land under Byzantine rule, the Muslim conquest was a welcome change. The Byzantines had prohibited Jews from worshiping in Jerusalem, and the Muslims freed them to do so. Context is always important. It's easy for people in modern democracies to think poorly of any conquering empire. But at the time that Islam came to rule the ancient land of Israel, it brought a set of religious teachings that seemed well designed to make room for Jews and conquered Christians as well, so long as they didn't challenge the ruling authorities. Western modern democracy was not going to be born for another 1,000 years. Most 8th century people assumed that the question was not whether a conquering empire was going to be in charge of them, but rather which one would be in charge and how they would treat their minorities. Again, by those measures, the small Jewish population in the Holy Land and the Jews living in Muslim lands abroad saw their lives improve dramatically under the Caliphate. Islam established a universal code requiring local Muslim authorities to respect and leave in peace the other, quote, peoples of the book, that is, Jewish and Christian monotheists. Their teachings also emphasized the duties of a host or a ruler towards those dependent upon their protection. Finally, the Muslim authorities did away with many of the restrictions that prevented Jews from being able to engage in international trade and doing business across the Mediterranean Sea. Something that Jews were in a good position to do given their dispersion across the region. And while Europe slipped into the Dark Ages, Islamic civilization flourished. So I know I said I was about to dive into doing background to the Palestinian narrative and the beginnings of it, and I am, but I'm also mixing in a little bit of a sidebar. I acknowledge that. But while we're talking about this historical period, and since I have what I presume is an overwhelmingly Jewish audience, I want to speak about two specific ways that the golden age of Islam forever influenced the Jews as a people. First, since even before the Roman destruction of the year 70 CE, there was a well established seafaring Jewish shipping and trading business connecting several Jewish diaspora communities that had already existed for several hundred years. But during most of the Middle Ages in Christian Europe, Jews were heavily boxed in to specific enclaves where they were allowed to live, and they were heavily restricted in the kinds of businesses they were allowed to do. There was a system of charters in Christian Europe that the Jews were subjected to wherever they lived. The local duke or baron would offer a charter to a particular Jewish community, allowing them to live within specific boundaries and only do certain forms of work. A popular choice was to have the Jews go collect the duke's taxes from the Christian peasants, a practice which helped create some of the ugly stereotypes about Jews and money. A charter might grant a specific group of Jews the right to live within a specific territory for 10 years or even 100, but it could also be revoked the moment it became politically expedient for the duke or the prince to scapegoat the Jews. And in fact, this happened over and over again, leading to the enduring image of the wandering Jew, whose misfortune and frequently occurring expulsions were believed by many in the church to be God's punishment of the Jews for rejecting Christ. By contrast, under the early Muslim caliphate during this era, it was a whole different set of rules for Jews. They were for sure second-class citizens and had many disadvantages compared to Muslims. But crucially, they were allowed to do business and had rights to travel and settle throughout the empire. It was Muslims who built the massive shipping and trading empire that you see on this map. But there were many Jews who took part in it. Jews earned a reputation as trustworthy conveyors of cargo, and they set up systems of credit using the Hebrew language as a kind of pre-modern layer of communications encryption for the financial transactions of Muslim traders doing deals around the world. A large class of Jews became the caliphate's UPS and PayPal service during this time. Part of what led to Jews culturally developing some of the skills that shaped their opportunities to flourish centuries later in modern open societies like the US got their start during this period. That's just important for all of us to recognize. The other way that Islam's golden age forever changed Judaism was through its own religious evolution during that golden age period. During this time, there was a flourishing of what we might today call liberal intellectual exploration in Islam. And its leading religious intellectuals embraced Greek philosophy and the sciences. These ideas influenced the leading Jewish rabbis and philosophers of this period, most famously Maimonides. The image that's on your screen right now is an actual fragment from a commentary on the Mishnah featuring some of Maimonides' handwritten notes. The entire document is written in Judeo-Arabic, a language like Yiddish that used Hebrew characters phonetically, but was primarily Arabic. The impacts that this era had on the development of Rabbinic Judaism influenced traditional Jewish practices immensely, so much so that it is fair to say that the Judaism we practice today would not be what it is without having been profoundly influenced by Islamic religious thought during this golden era. And you can also work it the other way. Islamic thought during this period could not have been what it was without its deep interest in Hebrew biblical and rabbinic interpretive study. This leads me to a quote I'll come back to later on that goes like this: "We are who we are in part because of who they are, and they are who they are in part because of us." This is not just a sweet thing to say, this is really true. Fast forward on the timeline to a few centuries and out of my sidebar and more genuinely into an early Palestinian narrative. And we come to the 4th century period in which the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, ruled Palestine. Throughout that time, Arabs were the supermajority in the land you can see in the oval on the screen. They lived in hundreds of villages, small cities, a few larger cities, including Jerusalem too. They were mostly Muslim, but a sizable minority were Christian, and they developed a rich culture of folkways, music, food, weaving, clothing, and agriculture. Ottoman rule was a mixed bag for Arabs in the region. The Turks were not ethnically Arab, and they dominated and divided the peoples of Arabia in ways that created growing resentment. And by the 1800s, an intensifying desire for Arab independence emerged, a desire to break free from Ottoman rule. In the late 1800s, the first Zionist settlers started arriving, buying small parcels of land and building homes and small farms on them. They were motivated by a desire to facilitate mass immigration of Jews to the land and to take at least part of it over as a nation state of their own. One of the teachings some of their leaders advocated was that Palestine was, quote, "a land without a people that should be made available for the Jews who were a people without a land." Also in the 1800s, an influential group of evangelical Christian leaders in Britain began promoting a theology known as dispensationalism, led in part by the British Bible scholar and teacher John Nelson Darby. Darby popularized an end times rapture theology that foretold of the Jews returning to the Holy Land en masse. Darby and other dispensationalists, including a growing number in America, would go on to create a large wave of Christian support for the modern Zionist movement as early as the time of Theodore Herzl. What starts to emerge in the English-speaking West is a two-pronged effort to justify a Jewish nation-building project in Palestine. One line of argument came from Herzl and other Western intellectuals, claiming that the current Arab inhabitants of the land were so sparse in number that in effect the land was empty and should be made available to the widely persecuted Jewish people. The other line of argument came from Christian dispensationalists. Although the dispensationalists were largely reacting to the disorienting experience of rapid change and industrial modernity, they developed an argument of religious conviction that viewed Palestinian Arabs as irrelevant to the cosmic religious end times drama that animated their worldview. These are examples of one of the most painful experiences Palestinians describe in their narrative of the conflict: the experience of not mattering, of being in the way, of being erased. A land without a people for a people without a land is but one example of a pattern of erasure of Palestinian Arab life in the land that Palestinians find deeply painful. There were, in fact, hundreds of thousands of Arabs living in the land in the 1800s, And as the turn of the 20th century arrived, many of them took care to preserve their land deeds and keys to their homes as they witnessed the Zionist movement and other Western powers, originating especially in Britain, aiming for the creation of a new state for the Jews in land that for them had been theirs and their ancestors for centuries. Okay, before we flip the script back to a Jewish narrative, a small but important diversion, courtesy of British history. You may remember the story of King Henry VIII, who couldn't get the Pope to okay the annulment he wanted and who ended up breaking his country away from Catholicism and founding the Anglican Church. In addition to this religious revolt, Protestantism arising from different grassroots sectarian groups on the European continent and in England itself became hugely influential. In accordance with Protestant belief, the Pope and papal authority were to be replaced by the doctrine of sola scriptura, the Christian Bible alone as the inerrant word of God. Henry VIII ordered that an English translation of the Bible be placed in every Anglican church. And as the historian Barbara Tuchman puts it, this is a quote, with the translation of the Bible into English and its adoption as the highest authority for an autonomous English church, the history, traditions, and moral law of the Hebrew nation became part of the English culture, became for a period of 3 centuries the most powerful single influence on that culture. She adds, and I quote, "Here is the curious fact of the family history of one nation becoming the national epic of another." Following the publication of the King James Bible in 1611, the next 3 centuries would see English children learning long chapters of it by heart, so much so that most English kids knew the geography of Palestine before they knew their own. It would influence Lord Balfour to become an advocate for Zionism. Puritanism, which flourished in the mid-1600s, led to advocacy for England to rescind a 350-year-old edict that had banned Jews from living there. The key Puritan advocates for repealing the ban on the Jews were explicit that their motive was in part so that England could position itself to take the lead in transporting the Jews back to the Promised Land. Here's a bit more from Barbara Tuchman. Starting with the Puritan ascendancy, the movement among the English for the return of the Jews to Palestine began. The movement was not for the sake of the Jews, but for the sake of the promise made to them. According to Scripture, the kingdom of Israel for all mankind would come when the people of Israel were restored to Zion. Only then would the world see the advent of the Messiah, or in Christian terms, the second advent. The return was visioned, of course, only in terms of a Jewish nation ultimately converted to Christianity, for this was to be the signal for the working out of the promise. Close quote. It's important to understand these influence and undercurrents in English religious culture as we approach the part of history in which England will be the ruling power in Palestine. Now, to be sure, this early form of Christian Zionism was not the only powerful force involved in England's decision-making. They also had economic reasons. Specifically, they wanted to maintain their road to India, their largest and most profitable colony, whatever it took to keep the French or the Russians from controlling the parts of the map that gave England faster and cheaper transportation to and from India. English rulers consistently opted for those policies. Okay, now we are ready to return to our dual narrative mode. So get ready for a little more whiplash. Here we go, Jewish-Israeli narrative. The beginnings of organized Zionism in the late 19th century came from a very specific set of contexts. The world's Jewish population was largest in Europe, including Russia, but there were also large Jewish populations in the Middle East, North Africa, and in North America. The Enlightenment had brought promises for the Jews of Europe that their many centuries of being repeatedly persecuted or expelled were over. Liberal democracies would provide voting rights, equal citizenship, and tolerance for Jews. But that promise was crumbling in multiple countries at once. Pogroms and blood libels exploded in Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, as well as in Syria. The rise of reverence for the sciences brought with it the spread of pseudoscientific racial theory, in which German intellectuals claimed a supreme Aryan race, a set of lesser races destined to be dominated by Aryans, and a pernicious and irredeemable race of Jews who seek to infest, usurp, and enslave the rest of humanity. In Muslim lands, while Jews had fared better than they had under the medieval church in Europe, it had turned out that being one of the legally protected religious minorities under Islamic rule wasn't always so great. This second-class status, known as dhimmi in Arabic, played itself out unevenly in different parts of the Muslim world. Jews were often publicly humiliated, unable to testify as witnesses in court, forced to pay higher taxes, and from time to time scapegoated by local leaders and even targeted for pogroms. All of this came to a head in the mind of one Austrian-born French journalist, Theodore Herzl, when he covered the famous Dreyfus case in France. For the sake of time, I won't rehash the Dreyfus case. The essential factor is that it was a shocking example of an obviously false accusation leading to a conviction of a French Jewish officer by a court that had been subjected to a coordinated campaign of rank anti-Semitic lobbying. Meanwhile, pogroms, state-supported riots, often featuring mass rape, murder, and property destruction against Jewish villages and neighborhoods, were carried out in Russia and Eastern Europe at an alarming rate. Paranoid theories about a global Jewish conspiracy were reprinted and translated into many languages. The invention of the telegraph allowed newspapers and magazines around the world to circulate these fake conspiracy theories rapidly, but also to carry news stories about the horrific pogroms destroying Jewish communities. And the news would reach people within a day or two of its occurrence. At that time, that was a shockingly fast speed. This was becoming a dizzying and scary time to be Jewish. So Herzl finds himself thinking about all these things. Maybe he's thinking about the events depicted in this map, showing centuries of repeated expulsions of Jews from one country after the next. Maybe he's thinking about the hope and promise of when each of these European governments instituted Enlightenment legal systems and emancipated their Jews from permanent persecuted status, and about how those hopes were being dashed by wave after wave of new violence and conspiracy theories circulating at the fast pace that new communication technologies had provided. Maybe he's worrying about the popular book by the German writer Wilhelm Marr, the man who coined the term anti-Semitism but meant it as a good thing. Maybe he's worried about the popular book that Wilhelm Marr circulated that was urging people to beware of the Jews who were engaging in a pernicious racial takeover and plotting against Aryans. As a newspaper reporter, The flourishing of these horrifying cartoons and memes across European mass culture must have terrified him. He finally concluded that what Jews needed if they were to survive was a state of their own. He wrote a manifesto called the Jewish State and then began a career as a political and diplomatic lobbyist and organizer, promoting the idea of the international community and the dominant world powers growing their support behind the establishment of a Jewish state in part of the Jews' ancient homeland. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress met in Basel, Switzerland, to discuss how to organize towards this goal. By 1914, the war to end all wars had begun. It would change everything. France, Russia, and England were fighting it out against Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The total population of the countries in Europe and Asia directly involved in the war was a bit over 700 million people. 20 million people would die, and another 21 million would be wounded in the fighting. Poison gas was widely used, and new technologies terrorized an entire generation on the battlefield, but also shocked people not on the battlefields by exposing them to photos, daily news reports, and personal anecdotes from the front via mass communication technologies like the telegraph. Eventually, the US would enter the war, and before the war's end, there would be a revolution in Russia giving birth to the Soviet Union, which then pulled out of the war. By the war's end, the Germans and the Ottomans were defeated, and the Ottoman Empire's many lands were carved up as spoils by the British and the French. During the course of the war, the British sought to enlist the support of Arabs and Jews alike. They wanted Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula to send troops to help them defeat the Turks and the Germans, and they wanted Jews in Britain, and especially the United States, to urge the US to join the war. They had an overblown perception of how influential American Jews were, and they were also being lobbied by their own Christian dispensationalists who wanted the Jews to return to Zion for religious reasons we've already discussed. So the British made conflicting promises. To the Arabs, they promised total independence as soon as the war was over. The cruel yoke of Ottoman imperial rule would be lifted, and self-determination, freedom, and independence would flourish in all Arab lands. This is what the British told Arab leaders. To the leaders of the Zionist movement, they promised to support the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine after the war. England's promise to the Jews took the form of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And I'll let those of you who can read and listen at the same time do your best to do that. But the key piece here is a declaration that England's government favors the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, will support immigration, and then adds this caveat that nothing should be done which might in any way harm or cause damage to the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So that declaration makes a huge impact. Jews who were supportive of the Zionist project rejoiced. The Arab leaders, particularly those who'd been in direct diplomatic discussion with the British, were shocked and furious. They thought that the promises that had been made to them were really, really clear. Independence in all of what they understood to be Arab lands, which certainly from their point of view included Palestine. And they were especially furious because they had held up their end of the bargain. They had mustered tens of thousands of Arab troops, many of whom died in battle, fighting on the British side of the war. And now they felt like they were being betrayed. After the war was over, the League of Nations was established, a forerunner to the United Nations. And they held a conference at San Remo in which they established as a matter of international law that the British and the French would be given what they called mandates to govern different Arab territories that had previously been under Ottoman rule. The mandates were to be temporary, and the European colonial powers were to help prepare the indigenous peoples for independence and self-government. Now, it won't surprise you that the Arabs found this patronizing and outrageous, but the League of Nations voted in favor of it, and they awarded Britain the mandate for Palestine, which, as you can see from this map, was defined as the territory that today includes Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and all of Jordan. The League of Nations included this language in authorizing the British mandate for Palestine. Whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country, it clearly being understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, for the Zionist movement, what this document meant was that it was a great day. It was the day that the project of building a national home in Zion finally was codified as a matter of international law, albeit a bit vaguely written, but still codified as a matter of what at this point served as international law, and that it was going to be subject, that implementing this project was going to be under the control of the British. This launched the efforts of Zionists to begin raising money and having supplies sent and immigrants recruited to come to the newly British-ruled territory. These are just some artifacts from that time. Actually, if you're able to look at this blown-up image of this coin from the British Mandate period, you can see the British trying to make space for themselves by using English for Palestinian Arabs by having the word Palestine spelled out in Arabic going up one curve of the coin, and then using Hebrew where it says Palestina in Hebrew, but then there's a parenthesis next to the end of the Hebrew word. And if you cock your head at an angle and read the two Hebrew letters that are inside the parentheses, it's an aleph and a yud. It stands for Eretz Yisrael. My guess is that what ended up on these coins was the result of boardroom compromises involving huge arguments that finally resulted in this kind of hodgepodge of everybody getting some little space to call this what they want to call it or express their claim. Anyway, Jewish immigrants came in waves, often fleeing pogroms, though some came from places like the US for ideological reasons. They bought land from Arab landowners who were often absentee landlords, members of wealthy families who had hired local Palestinian Arabs to farm the land and live modestly on it while helping the absentee landlord owning class profit. The Jewish immigrants built kibbutzim and schools, they organized self-defense and paramilitary units, and they began to have more and more clashes with the local Arab population. Moving ahead to the 1930s, as Germany fell into Nazism, the British struggled to maintain their strategic dominance throughout the Middle East. They took some steps to empower partial independence among some Arab leaders, while continuing to promise more than they were actually prepared to deliver in terms of the fate of Palestine, which remained a sore point. As Jews and Arabs and the British forces controlling Palestine began to fight more and more, they became concerned about the impact of increasing Jewish immigration to Palestine on their ability to keep things under control. They had a fortune, the British did, invested in their colony in India, and the movement to oust the British in India was by now well underway, and they wanted to maintain control, especially of the Suez Canal and Palestine and the Sinai, in order to keep their shipping lanes to India intact. Meanwhile, things got more grim for the Jews in Germany. It became clear that there was potentially going to be a mass expulsion, or a series of them, of Jews from Central Europe. And tens of thousands of Jews were already making applications to get out. An emergency conference of world powers was called and held in Evian, France, with the goal of getting countries to agree to receive large numbers of Jewish refugees. Only one country was willing to increase its quota at all, the Dominican Republic. The conference convinced Zionist leaders of their purpose more than ever. By 1939, the Second World War had begun, and the British had begun to get exhausted by quelling Arab and Jewish uprisings in Palestine. With Hitler's armored armies conquering everything in their path, the English became terrified that they would lose their passage to India and access to oil supplies in Arab lands. And they reversed course on the Balfour Declaration. They issued the 1939 White Paper, which walked back the idea of a future Jewish state. And more importantly, it restricted the number of Jews allowed to immigrate to Palestine to 15,000 a year, just as the final solution was gearing up to speed under the Nazis. Let's take a step back for a quick overview of the British Mandate period. During this time, we see the rise and intensification of Arab nationalism. There's an increase in Jewish and Arab immigration to Palestine. Arab immigration largely because the British really did invest heavily in building roads, train lines, schools, and electricity, and it sparked a lot of economic growth. The British, hoping to soften the blow to Arabs that the Balfour Declaration had represented, divided the territory of Palestine into two different entities in 1922, creating the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan east of the Jordan River and leaving everything west of the Jordan as Palestine. In Jordan, they installed a king whom they hoped would be a loyal pawn. Violence grew between all three of the parties. The British foreign policy kept shifting this way and that, which served to undermine their credibility and increase resentments. Hitler came to power, and the Jews of Europe entered what would become their darkest years. And between 1936 and 1939, a major Arab uprising took place in Palestine, targeting the British and the Jews alike. From a Jewish point of view, the British were unfair and cruel. When they created the country of Jordan in 1922, they banned Jewish immigration to it, which the Zionists perceived as a huge blow to their project. And then in 1939, the British severely limited Jewish immigration to what remained of Palestine, resulting indirectly in who knows how many Jews getting killed by the Nazis instead of escaping to Palestine. Since I'm still telling the Jewish narrative, I'll add that throughout the Mandate period, there were many attacks by Arabs against Jewish civilians. Of course, there were just as many. In fact, today Israeli historians concede probably there were more attacks by Jewish militants against Arab civilians. But one of the great flaws of each side's narrative is that it tends to emphasize its own victims of violence and deny or minimize its own acts of violence. What you're seeing here is a partial spreadsheet of acts of deadly violence carried out against Jewish civilians by Arabs during this period. We'll see a similar slide later on when we flip over to the Palestinian narrative. There's another important piece to share that's part of the Jewish narrative. After the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, the British expelled a number of key Palestinian leaders. One of them, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, was a religious and political leader known as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He fled to Lebanon and to Iraq. In Iraq, he collaborated closely with the Nazis and their supporters. He traveled to Germany and met the SS and he helped channel Nazi propaganda about Jews into. Could everyone mute themselves, please? Um, and he helped channel Nazi propaganda about Jews into radio and newspapers in Iraq and other parts of the Arab world. In 1941, there was a coup in Iraq in which a government that had essentially been a British puppet fell to a group of officers who had been promised independence by the Nazis if they would just support Germany in the war. They came to power with the Mufti's support, and they helped spur a massive pogrom in Baghdad that killed over 100 Jews and destroyed hundreds of Jewish homes and businesses. It is called the Farhud, and it contributed to what would later become a mass exodus of Jews from Iraq to Israel. I want to just offer a quick warning that there's some disturbing images from the Nazi Holocaust on this next slide. Of course, an essential part of the Jewish narrative is the Shoah, the Nazi Holocaust. In the space of 4 years, 2/3 of the Jews of Europe were murdered. 90% of the 3 million Jews of Poland were murdered. It was the most efficient and industrialized act of genocide that had ever taken place. And there really aren't words to describe it. I'll leave you with this photo, which became iconic in Israeli society. It's a snapshot taken by a German soldier in the Warsaw Ghetto of a little boy surrendering. To whom and for what, we don't know. But this image became a symbol of the powerlessness and helplessness that many survivors of the Shoah felt. And it fueled what would become part of the Israeli national character of deciding to learn how to fight fiercely and shrewdly and become tough as nails. During and after the war, tens of thousands of Jews made their way to Palestine illegally, running the British blockade and using whatever acts of deception, bribery, and moral suasion they could to gain entry. In 1961, Israel even issued a postage stamp commemorating and celebrating illegal immigration. Just think about that for a quick second as Americans. Okay, I've been speaking from within the Jewish narrative for a long stretch. I see that I've gone for a little bit over an hour. I'm going to go for a bit further, but we're getting close to the finish line. I want us to take a moment to step out of both narratives. I also want to invite people to take a breath. I've been sort of stair-stepping up the emotional intensity of the content, and things have gotten intense by now. Let's take a moment to step out of both narratives and consider an important difference in the way that Jews and Palestinians tend to frame and understand this conflict. From its beginnings, Zionists have tended to look at this issue from a global bird's eye vantage point. Their people was an unusually configured people among the various nations and peoples of the world. The Jews were a people with a long ancient history tied to a specific land, but for a very long time, interspersed across many countries, and coming to realize that no matter what political system or rulers are in charge, anti-Semitism seems to recur and put Jewish lives in danger. Since Jews had for centuries had to deal with negotiating with whomever the local or national rulers were in order to survive, it is not surprising that the early Zionists tended to think that the way to solve the problem of Jewish survival was to do two things. First, find world leaders who could be convinced to help them essentially create a self-contained fortress where the Jews could be left alone. So for the Zionists, going to the Ottomans and the British and whomever else had the power in the world was the reasonable thing to do. It did not occur to many of them to go directly to Palestinian Arab villagers and ask their permission. Those people weren't in charge of the country anyway. The Ottomans were, and then the British were. And from a Jewish historical sensibility, it seemed likely that it would always be one empire or another. They also imagined that the security and dignity that came from having a land of their own was more important than the specific ties to one's own personal land that so many Palestinian Arabs felt deeply. Let me say that again. The Zionists imagine that the security and dignity that came from having a land of your own, a country, was more important to people than the specific ties to one's own personal land that so many Palestinian Arabs felt deeply. Were confused by the intensity of Arab rejection of their project. Many Zionists thought that Arab nationalism was absolutely 100% right and just, and that it would be satisfied by the establishment of one or more large, independent Arab countries, and that as long as every people in the region deserving of a state got a state, there was plenty of room for the Jews to have a small piece of the overall regional pie. And that's a bird's eye view. Palestinian Arabs, by contrast, come to the conflict from a vantage point that is firmly rooted in their homes and villages, in local places that had become part of their extended family and family clan's identity over centuries. They endured Ottoman and British rule, but they always viewed those forces as outsiders. And when Arab nationalism and anti-colonialism gained momentum across the colonized parts of the world, they also sought independence and freedom. For Herzl to visit foreign leaders and for Chaim Weizmann to get European powers to sign papers awarding some of their lands to future Jewish immigrants, whom they tended to view as exclusively European, it seemed bizarre and outrageous to Palestinian Arabs. When it comes down to a Palestinian, what it comes down to from a Palestinian perspective is that whatever the Jews' collective grievances were against Europe, or even most of the rest of the world, it could not legitimate their attempt to build a new country on top of places that were part of the weave of Palestinian Arab villages, towns, families, and culture. There is a popular song by the Israeli artist Yehudit Rabitz, whose chorus is Dvarim shaloim misham lo roim mikan. The things that can be seen from there can't be seen from here. I think of that lyric when I think about the radical difference between the Zionists' bird's eye view and the Palestinians' ground level view. So let's take a deep breath, and for this last segment, shift to the Palestinian narrative, picking up on the eve of World War I. So first, some context. As this map shows, European powers had colonized most of Africa and Arab Northern Africa, while the Ottomans held the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf region. This is actually a map of Palestinian villages, towns, and cities at the time of the very first Zionist colony built in 1878. One of the dots on this map is blue, and that's the first Zionist colony. The rest of these are Palestinian villages and towns at that time. These were just a few photos I threw in for atmospherics. Sorry, I got a little bit pulled aside from the flow of my narration, but let's come back. Arabs in Palestine and elsewhere resented Ottoman rule. The Turks were quite clear that they were not ethnically speaking Arabs, and they were known for viewing Arabs with disdain. And Arabs resented this enormously. The Ottomans, They weren't just snobby, they subdivided political districts according to their own interests. They appointed Turkish outsiders to rule in specific Arab lands, and they intentionally stoked conflicts between different Arab appointed princes and petty potentates. They did a lot of divide and conquer. So, in many capitals of the Arab world, including Damascus, Beirut, and Cairo, Arab intellectuals, tribal leaders, laborers, and writers began to organize to oust the Turks. Then World War I began, and the British and the French, sensing opportunity, came knocking, promising Arab independence in exchange for Arab troops and supplies and other logistical support for the war effort. People like the famed Lawrence of Arabia emerged from these battles. By the way, you can see the tone and tenor of this English newspaper headline about the day that the British forces succeeded in defeating the Turks and retaking Jerusalem. That probably didn't win them very many friends in the Arab world. So, the European powers made big promises to various Arab leaders. Arab nationalism and the desire for Arab independence in a post-imperial, post-colonial new world of independent nation states, representing the peoples indigenous to their lands. That was the promise the European powers repeated over and over again. Woodrow Wilson was giving voice to this as a form of idealism that should guide the entire world. That was part of what involved his decision to get the US involved in the war. So the various Arab communities throughout the region are hearing these promises being spoken by French, by British, by Americans. And when the war is over, with shameful audacity, the European powers broke these promises left and right. You may remember that earlier we saw that the Russians were on the side of the English and the French in World War I, up until the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution founded the Soviet Union. At that point, Russia withdrew from the war, but the new Soviet regime discovered something that the Tsarists had signed off on with the British and the French, something that they knew would infuriate the Arabs seeking their own liberation, and that they hoped might influence Arab leaders to consider aligning with the new communist bloc. With knowledge and approval from the Tsarist Russian ruler, the British and the French had met and signed a secret agreement called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, in which they brazenly agreed that they had no intention of giving the Arabs independence after the war, that after they won the war, they intended to divide the Arab lands into zones: British zone, a French zone, and for Palestine, a regime that several Western powers would oversee. The new Soviet government exposed the agreement and humiliated the British and the French. Nevertheless, Sykes-Picot was the plan that the British and the French implemented. They lobbied the new League of Nations to formalize the plan more or less into law. They justified it by proclaiming that the British and the French were not colonizers. No, not this time. This time they were going to be given these lands in trust as mandates, and they would be required to develop the infrastructure and help educate and prepare the natives for independence at some future date. The British got Palestine and Iraq. The French got Syria and a lot of direct influence over Lebanon. Second state, it's a long story involving the British and several different prominent Arab clans that we'll skip, but ultimately the United States made some major deals. Oops, we lost you for
Oh,
just a moment.
yeah. Huh.
Was it for
Can you
just a
get,
moment?
Rabbi, we lost you
um,
for about 30 to 60 seconds just at the end of your last sentence.
Okay, let's see. Let's go back. Um, what looks familiar?
Uh, we'd passed this.
Yeah,
Oh,
How about there?
Sykes-Picot, we did
we
it.
were on Sykes-Picot when you blinked out.
Okay, well, clearly somebody was unhappy with my providing that information. Okay, what I was trying to get down to was that the League of Nations goes ahead and says we're going to go ahead and implement Sykes-Picot more or less. The British and the French say, don't worry, we're not colonizing this time. We're going to hold these territories as mandates, and we will, quote unquote, prepare the natives to be ready for independence and self-government. And they promised to invest in building up the infrastructure of these territories. And you can see that the British got Palestine and Iraq, and the French got Syria, as well as essentially control over Lebanon. And the United States basically got a cozy relationship with what ended up being an independent Saudi Arabia, which is a very long story I'm not going to go into tonight. Um, so, meanwhile, remember, we're doing this from a Palestinian narrative perspective. Meanwhile, now that these mandates have been set up, um, which is completely humiliating and infuriating to Arabs throughout all of the Middle East, the British immediately go forward and allow the Zionist leaders to organize and to begin sending large numbers of Jewish immigrants. And they did, and they started arriving in waves. And they started buying land from anybody who would sell it to them. Often, the owners of land in Palestine lived far, far away and had little connection to the local Palestinian villagers and peasants who actually lived and worked the land for generations. So Zionists would buy the land from absentee landowners and then begin to build and farm in new ways. And Palestinian Arabs objected strongly to the British plan to allow the new Jewish arrivals to keep expanding their footprint. And they complained and complained, and the British didn't really listen very much in the early going. So let's listen to how a historian of this period, Donna Robinson Devine, describes part of the story. She writes, it was less the sheer number of Jewish newcomers during the British Mandate period than their definition of settlement that threatened Palestinian Arabs. Generations of Palestinian Arabs had inscribed on the countryside their own version of an ordered landscape. Villages, sacred sites, hills covered with olive trees, plains cultivated with grains, but often empty of permanent dwellings. In contrast, Jews remade the land and the landscape. They plowed the fields more deeply than the Arabs, and they irrigated more extensively. They enclosed their property with wire fences. On their collective farms, settlers constructed central dining rooms, schools, barns, and stables, adding to the inventory of unfamiliar objects injected onto Palestine's landscape. The use of the land changed as much as the structures placed on it. Jewish settlers were only just now learning how to be farmers, but they came equipped with modern tools and the capital to purchase the latest agricultural techniques. New crops and methods ushered in not just another way of doing things, but another way of thinking, all of which had profound and unsettling effects on Palestinian Arabs. I want to cycle back through those images for a moment. And I'll just mention from a Palestinian narrative perspective, one of the really painful things that Jews sometimes say with pride, and they overhear, is, well, we came and drained the swamps. The place was a mess. We fixed it up. The Palestinians left the swamps where they were because the swamps served useful purposes in the ecosystem and in the ways in which their towns and villages approached agriculture. These gentle slopes, these orchards, this semi-terraced approach towards farming, this way of building either packed together closely in a valley or sloping gently up the side of a hill, and then letting lots of other areas lie fallow or lie untouched. This was Palestinian culture and life on the land. So when they would hear Zionists refer to the Palestinians as, well, they don't know what they're doing, this is backward, this was hugely offensive to them. And then when they saw these folks come and start building these structures onto the land, that felt enormously threatening. The palpable feeling that the British are basically given carte blanche to a really foreign group of people to come here and build their country, and they're really not asking our permission, and we really don't want to give it. That feeling just grew stronger and stronger and stronger. Quite a few Zionist leaders during this period also wrote and spoke openly about their hope that one day that they would get a chance to do what today we would call ethnic cleansing, but which they called transferring the Arab population. These are real quotes. Ben Gurion, in a letter to his son, the Arabs will have to go. We must expropriate gently the private property and spirit the penniless population across the border. David Ben Gurion, in many parts of the country, new settlement will not be possible without transferring the Arab fellahin, the peasants and farm workers. It is important that this plan comes from the British, not from us. Jewish power, which grows steadily, will also increase our possibilities to carry out the transfer on a large scale. And then he makes the argument that this is a humane thing to do. Okay. So these people are writing and publishing this stuff. It's being read in the open. Palestinians are aware of it and are reading it. Here's Vladimir Jabotinsky in 1923. He says, every indigenous people will resist. Sorry, I'm having this get blocked. Oops. Will resist alien settlers as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of the danger of foreign settlement. That is what the Arabs in Palestine are doing, and they'll persist in doing it, et cetera, et cetera. And he goes on to say, we're going to need to carry this out in defiance of the will of the native population, and we're going to have to colonize and continue to develop under the protection of a force independent of the local population, iron wall, which the native population cannot break through. And Jabotinsky, who was the right wing of the Zionist movement at this time, does not like the labor Zionists and the Zionists who talk about sort of trying to have a more peaceful and genteel dialogue with the Arabs, because he thinks they're just being hypocrites. He thinks that this really is an us or them thing, and when it comes down to it, we're going to have to push them out. And these are, I didn't just cherry pick these badly, unfairly, these quotes. These are highly representative of a lot of what was being written, said, and published. And a lot of Palestinian Arabs saw it, read it, and were shocked by it. So, Arabs organized villages in the big cities. They had local and regional leaders who fought diplomatically. They had merchant strikes, mass demonstrations. Some of the groups turned violent, but most did not. They generally found the British to be aloof, arrogant, and unhelpful. In 1936, Arabs began a sustained campaign of crippling protests, including riots and some paramilitary actions. The British were quickly overwhelmed, and they began enlisting the support of the Haganah, the main Jewish militia, to put down the Arab revolt. In 1939, the British finally quelled the uprising, and they decided to deport a large number of Arab leaders. During the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, between 12 and 17% of Palestinian Arab adult males were either killed, wounded, exiled, or imprisoned. This had a devastating impact on the Palestinian Arab population over the course of the next decade, 1939 to 1949. The political and military leadership of Palestinian society had been effectively decimated and decapitated. The British had boosted the main Zionist fighting forces and the proto-state organizations the unions, the school organizations, and so forth, into a much stronger position in their putting down this Arab revolt of 36 to 39. And in the course of the decade that followed, 39 to 49, Palestinian Arab society was never able to fully regroup and reorganize for the coming struggle with the Zionists. This is really important to understand. Meanwhile, a faction that split off from the Haganah, the Irgun, led by future Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, engaged in many acts of terrorism against Arab civilians. This started as a policy of reprisals in kind after Arab terrorist attacks, but then the Irgun escalated beyond that. Just as earlier I showed a couple partial screenshots of lists of Arab attacks against Jewish civilians during the British Mandate period, here are a couple partial screenshots of attacks by the Irgun against Arab civilians and others, such as British soldiers and diplomatic officials. As I said, inside both narratives, you'll usually only see one of these lists, the one in which our side were the victims and the other side were the perpetrators. We've been moving really quickly through the years between the two world wars from a Palestinian narrative perspective, but there's an important theme that I've heard in listening to how many Palestinians have described this period, and that is the experience of having many different forces arrayed against you that want something of yours and that keep improving their position and creating ever more facts on the ground, while at the same time calling on you to be reasonable and negotiate a resolution. From a Palestinian perspective, what might have felt reasonable would have been for representatives of the Zionist movement to come to Palestine's indigenous leaders and plead their case before they began immigrating, buying land, building communities. Would have been the Zionists seeking the Palestinians' uncoerced agreement to live in some kind of partition in the future, based on Jewish historical and religious claims and on the peril Jews found themselves in. Now, leave aside for a moment whether that idea seems absurd, naive, or even unfair to Jews facing mass pogroms and the rise of anti-Semitic fascism. On the ground, where Palestinian families and shopkeepers, professors and doctors, peasants and urbanites were living their lives with deep roots in those places, the Zionist movement seemed like a juggernaut, engaging in many different strategies at once towards winning an independent state. Zionism's leaders are leveraging their contacts throughout the Jewish diaspora to try to move the hearts of powerful world leaders, first the Ottomans, then the British, then the Americans, even neighboring Arab kings. Some Zionists are bringing the organizing revolutionary skills of socialism from Russia and Ukraine and building self-sustaining farms and trade unions. Some have wealth and are buying land from wealthy absentee Arab landowners who didn't care about the Palestinian peasants' attachments to the land. Other Zionist arrivals are poor, are the survivors of brutal violence and persecution. They are street tough and self-organizing into paramilitary units. And every year, more of them. And every year, mixed messages from them. Come, negotiate with us, but then with multiple outside powers looking for some kind of partition as the obvious result. And then at the same time, the Zionists are building an army. And during the Arab revolt of the late 30s, they used that army to assist the British in expelling the entire Palestinian political leadership. And then those same Zionist leaders after 1939 would say, come negotiate. The Zionists are approaching the problem of achieving their goal by drawing on many of the social and political tools that being the unique diaspora people they have been for centuries has given them. They can play the bird's eye view diplomacy game because it is the game they've been in for centuries, It's a game they've needed to learn how to play, survive. For the Palestinians, it's like they've been called out of their homes by new neighbors asking them to come play a high stakes game in which at the end of the game, one way or another, they will lose. Lose land, lose power, lose the hope of independence that the various great nations had promised. I'm not for a second trying to paint a picture of the simple, noble, and peasant-like Palestinian being overwhelmed by cosmopolitan forces, because that would be a false caricature of both groups. The Palestinian population during this period, rich, bourgeois, working class, and dirt poor, secular and religious, Muslim and Christian. And the Palestinians were facing the same new, rapidly changing world, rife with opportunities for them to decide what kind of modern society they would like to build. But the tools that their historical experience had given them were not ones that could stop the growing squeeze of the multifaceted progress the Zionists would make year after year by creating multiple forms of facts on the ground and working to bring ever more immigrants. Many Palestinians understood well that there was fear and desperation driving these Jewish newcomers. And some had a heart to try to help them. But from a Palestinian narrative perspective, what Zionism brought them was an endless catch-22 of no good options and a series of humiliating invitations to negotiate the degree of their own dispossession, while the situation on the ground for them kept weakening. Do you agree to play a game you didn't ask for and that has been forced upon you without your consent? Or do you opt instead to do your best to fight with the tools you have and try to keep what has been yours for centuries? This was a pivotal question for Palestinians and a key part of the Palestinian narrative. So World War II finally ended, and the United Nations arose as a second attempt at something like the previously created League of Nations. UN faced was the crisis of what to do with about 250,000 Jewish refugees living in European displaced persons camps, DP camps, many of which were squalid and horrible. Some of the Polish Jews in the camps had attempted to return to their homes in Poland, only to be protested and in some cases murdered by Poles who were unwilling to readmit them. Yeah. The wealthy nations of the world largely kept their doors closed to Jews. It's a cold fact that rare exceptions, political leaders just aren't.
Hello, excuse me. We have some people who are unmuted and are interfering. Can you please mute yourselves? Thank you.
It is a sad, cold fact that with rare exceptions, political leaders just aren't willing to take in penniless, war-traumatized refugees who belong to a minority. Many of the member nations in the UN began looking to Palestine as an answer to this problem. And that's where we're going to pick it up next time. So thank you. I know I ran somewhat long tonight. It comes in a little shorter the next times, but I'm glad we covered what we covered. And this is why I said early on, we definitely need a 2-hour time slot for this. We have a little bit more than 10 minutes, and I'm really happy to respond to the number of questions possible in this short window of time, but you can also, and I'm happy to respond to questions via email throughout the course of the course as well. And David, will it be you who?
Rabbi, I just sent you the first question, labeled first question, which was strikingly similar to your very last remarks, but obviously drafted before it. But maybe you could amplify that a little bit, and I will try to pick out some of the many questions that are filtering through the chat right now.
didn't quite entirely catch that.
I sent you one question labeled first question. If you can
Okay,
scroll up,
got
you
it,
can
got it,
find
got it.
it. And while you're working on that, I'll
Oh, I
get you
see. Okay,
get you more.
right. 1945 post-war until 1948, how many Jewish refugees were there? I've seen numbers from anywhere from 200 to 300,000 that were in the displaced persons camps. Um, and but I have to say I've also heard that it's a little bit difficult because there were also a lot of Jewish refugees who were in transit, and um, this is so it's kind of difficult to say for sure. So there were some who were in transit and who successfully were able to return to, the land that where had been home. There were some who ended up in very long transit journeys because the Soviet authorities were the ones under whose authority they fell. And um, by and large, they were treated well and they were treated as refugees by the Soviet army. But many of them ended up on long circuitous journeys that may or may not have ultimately taken them to uh, the place they had intended to go. And it's hard to give very, very solid numbers. The numbers I'm sure about are the between 2 and 300,000 in the DP camps. And I will say, like in 2024, that number doesn't necessarily sound like a staggeringly large number. But remember, the world population, I think at 1945 was I think it was like just around 1 billion. Um, so, that seemed like a massive crisis to the UN, and it was the single largest refugee crisis that they were facing.
I just sent you what I have called as the second question.
Oh, thank you. I like this. I like this approach. Um, I see. First question. Second question. Were there really Arab leaders or organizations on the ground in the 40s? Some viewers question the level of coherence and leadership actually present, like during the after 1939. I'm assuming that's the question. After so many of the folks in leadership of the Palestinian Arab community had been deported. Yeah, there were, but it was a mess. Is what I've learned reading several historical accounts. And it's not. This is not really a dispute, something that's disputed in either narrative. That that what was difficult was that there wasn't strong unified leadership for Palestinian Arabs, and um, you know by the time you get to 1947, there are things moving really fast in other parts of the Arab world, right? I mean, there are other Arab leaders who are seizing the opportunity to come into power, and people are starting to organize a whole different set of alliances. Some of them are getting caught up in the Cold War. Um, but, you know, the long and the short of it is, yes, there were Arab leaders that were much more poorly organized, had far less solid backing representing subgroups within Palestinian society, but who did come and meet with officials from the United Nations um, that were making these in the 30s and 40s, um, to try to see if they could get the Palestinian Arab leaders and the Zionist leaders to sit down in a room together and negotiate. Um, we'll see next time that there was also a recurring pattern that like their legitimacy was very wobbly in the minds of their own.
Hmm. I think we were very fortunate.
It seems like the rabbi has bounced off. I can't explain why that might be. I suspect his internet connection became unstable. we're going to wait a minute to see if he rejoins us. Um, in the meanwhile, I'll give some thanks uh, because it was a wonderful and very energetic perspective. Rabbi Maurice, I see you're
So,
back.
He's back, yeah.
sorry about that. I don't know where you lost me, but I probably did the best I could on that question anyway. Is there a third question?
I've just sent you one.
Oh, there is. Do I speak Arabic? Are there resources or books I recommend for a full or dual perspective or a Palestinian view? I don't speak very good Arabic. My mom's first language is Arabic, um, and I speak really good Hebrew, but I don't speak very good Arabic, unfortunately. And I kind of wish I'd taken advantage of the opportunity to learn, maybe in college. Um, you know, those two books I showed at the beginning, I can send an email to folks at WES.
Yes.
I do think they're both decent. They both could use some better editing, but one of them is called Side by Side, and the other one is called One Land, Two Stories. Um, as far as like things I would recommend in terms of Palestinian narratives, then I am of um, histories, uh, and I, I have this problem with histories that are written that are clearly written by Jews who feel their Zionism very deeply. Um, I find myself getting frustrated with things I know they're leaving out. Authors who are I find myself getting defensive and frustrated. So maybe that is my shortcoming. But so my sweet zone where I'm able to really sort of take in stuff that might be hard to hear is in memoir form. And I like memoirs also because they tend to be much less polemical and much more heartbreaking and earnest. So that's my wisdom on that for you. There are some decent like college history textbook kind of books that are out there where the authors are neither Jewish nor Arab nor Palestinian and have actually done a really fine job of trying to treat both sides fairly, and you can tell by the way that they present each chapter and by the way that they raise questions about um, you know, the way they double back and question their own assumptions periodically and encourage readers to think critically. And I can also, I'm thinking of one book in particular. If someone asks me again via email, I will send these various titles.
I'm trying to put together another question, but I have to type it out. 1 second.
While you're doing that, let me just say a quick word about next time. So in my experience, the second session of this is often the most emotionally challenging one. And we're going to spend a lot of time looking at the two narratives accounts of the events from 1947 to 1949, and the two narratives are so different, and the amount of emotional investment in both narratives, in the many claims that are part of those two tellings of those key years, um, it it can be. I've had the experience, especially with Jewish audiences, of um, folks who've actually never heard a Palestinian narrative of those years, and so it can be really shocking and unsettling. Um, so I'm just throwing that out there, that it might be a little bit more might require a little more emotional heavy lifting. Yeah.
Rabbi,
Fourth
I'm going to
question was,
jump in. I sent the fourth question, but we are at 9, so I'm going to ask you to be very brief, and then we can wrap up. Is that okay?
sure. Yeah, this question was about agrarian Arab society in Palestine who didn't own a lot of the land, and were they ripe for exploitation by someone? Absolutely. And, you know, actually, there are in the field of Palestine studies where a lot of people who work on PhDs and do like fresh kinds of exploration of history of Palestinian society, one of the hot areas is looking at class and the relationships between these absentee landlords who lived usually in places like Lebanon and Syria. And and Palestinian farmers. But I want to also just caution folks, it's not correct that, that describes 90% of the Palestinians who were living in the land in the 19th and 20th century. That describes, maybe half. But remember, there are also medium-sized and large cities. There is an intellectual elite. There is some old money wealth. There is some industry. There are some people involved in trade and business. There is Christian religious life. There is Muslim religious life. The society is already pretty mixed and complex. And yes, the short answer to your question was yes. Those peasants were being exploited, and there were some exploitative and unhealthy relationships between, just as there are between homogenous groups in any society.
Rabbi, we thank you for your lengthy and very gracious and comprehensive lecture. And we thank you for the questions, and we thank you for all of your time. And many thanks to the people at the WES community in the Israel Connections Committee and the Adult Ed Committee and all of those who made this possible. We will try to do a tighter presentation on the next one out. It's a week from today at 7 p.m. And we thank all of you who've attended. There were really quite a few, over 155 at the maximum. So that's quite remarkable and worthy of kudos. So
Thank you. And thank you all for taking the time. I really appreciate that so much, to take the time to spend with this material.
Thank you,
care.
David.
Thanks so much. Good night.
good night,
Thank you,
everybody.
David, for everything you put into this. It's been amazing.
Well, it was a really terrific event, and we're looking forward to 3 more.
Okay.
So we will see you all pretty soon.
Thank you from Massachusetts.
Awesome.
David,
Stay dry.
thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you from Panama.
For Panama. So, we're
It
all
was
spread out.
it was a very interesting, wonderful thing. Thank you.
Len, does your young bride want to show her face?